crusade.
New to GB News is the Saturday 5.
5 times the opinion.
Join us every Saturday from 8 p.m.
as we debate the week's stories.
With us 4, plus a special guest.
And at 9, of course, it's Mark Dolan Tonight. Brand new Saturday nights on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Hello, good evening. It's me, Jacob Rees-Mogg, on State of the Nation Tonight. It's less than a week to go before the government will send emergency alerts to every telephone in the country. I'll be explaining how you can preempt the mission creep and disable the notifications in advance of Sunday. Since the 2016 referendum, the government has lost more than half of all votes in the House of Lords. Is it time to scrap our beloved upper chamber? I'll defend it and strongly support the idea of a second chamber. But one of my next guests doesn't agree. Vox Populi Vox Dei, we asked the people what they thought of the House of Lords, and here's a taste of what they had to say.
It probably needs for them to be there a bit more, probably. I don't suppose all of them are there every day.
We'll be hearing more from the great British public later on. Owing to endless waiting lists and countless cancelled appointments, more and more of us are using private healthcare. Is it time politicians admitted to doing the same? I do, and I'm not ashamed of it either. And just to wrap things up, all weekend we saw reports of the animal rights activists once again disrupting the Grand National. I'll be debating with one of their spokesmen shortly. State of the Nation starts now. We'll also be hearing from our esteemed panel, the ferocious Toby Young of the Free Speech Union and the popular socialist and former Labour MP, Stephen Pound. As ever, I want to hear from you. It's the key part of the programme. Email me, mailmog@gbnews.uk. Now it's time for the all-important headlines with Tatiana Sanchez.
Jacob, thank you very much and good evening. This is the latest from the GB Newsroom. The Prime Minister is under investigation by Parliament's ethics watchdog over a possible failure to declare an interest. Downing Street says the inquiries over claims he failed to tell MPs his wife might benefit from a major measure announced in last month's budget. She holds shares in Koru Kids, a childcare agency likely to gain financially from a drive to recruit more childminders. Number 10 says the Prime Minister will clarify how it was declared as a ministerial interest rather than to the Commons. Meanwhile, Mr Sunak has accepted the UK doesn't have enough teachers to deliver on his ambition to improve children's numeracy skills. He says an anti-maths mindset is costing the UK economy tens of billions of pounds each year and wants to ensure the subject is studied by all students in England up to the age of 18.
The UK is one of the least numeric countries in the developed world. More than 8 million adults have numeracy skills below those expected of a 9-year-old. And around a third of our young people don't pass maths GCSE. We make jokes about not being able to do maths. It's socially acceptable. We say things like, oh, maths, I can't do that, it's not for me, and everyone laughs. But we'd never make a joke like that about not being able to read.
NHS England has said nearly 200,000 hospital appointments and procedures had to be rescheduled due to the strike by junior doctors this month. It includes people who were waiting for operations and other treatments, as well as scans and follow-up appointments. Tens of thousands of workers staged a 96-hour strike in a dispute over pay between April 11th and the 15th. It comes as the Prime Minister admitted it'll be a challenge to cut NHS waiting times because of industrial action, while also adding that he remains hopeful wait times can ultimately be cut. Well, some breaking news this hour. Play was stopped at the World Snooker Championships after protesters disrupted the competition in Sheffield, pouring orange powder onto one of the tables. The incident, which unfolded live on television, was carried out by members of Just Stop Oil. At least 2 of the protesters were wrestled away from the main arena. Officials are now determining what the powder contained and whether it can be cleaned up in time to allow competition to resume this evening. And more than 5,000 people have crossed the English Channel in small boats this year. GB News can exclusively reveal around 120 people have arrived today, with 3 small boats intercepted by UK authorities. It's after a surge in small boat crossings as criminal people smuggling gangs take advantage of better weather conditions. TV, online, DAB+ radio and on TuneIn. This is GB News. Now it's back to Jacob.
Cry God for Harry, England and St George. His Majesty's government has decided our telephones will screech at us on St George's Day as a test warning. I'm afraid to say I've disabled my government warning system because I think that it will end up being used in the way the Met Office gives us warning, to tell us the blindingly obvious. That is to say that the weather's going to be hot and perhaps we should have a glass of water. Or there may be a storm and it may not be wise to go out, or it may be cold and we should wrap up warmly. I don't think that that is why we have telephones. I think we have them as a service that we want to use, that we pay for to communicate with people, not to be shouted at by the government that it's maybe trivial. And if there's something that has happened that is serious, won't we actually know anyway? Those of you who watch GB News will undoubtedly know, because you'll have heard it on the news. But if something is building up to a great disaster, are we to assume that people are so stupid that they haven't paid any attention to what's been going on? And this seems to me a mistaken role for the state to be taking. It is back to the nanny state, warning us, telling us, mollycoddling us, when instead they should just let people get on with their lives and make sensible decisions for themselves. And it's really an intrusive extension of the information that was used during COVID. During COVID, the government got access to our mobile records to know what people's movements were, to know, were we going into work, were we going around the country, were we moving, were we staying at home. They could say whether a telephone was being used close to its home base, its home registered address for billing, or was it being used further afield. It was being used essentially to monitor people's behaviour as part of the lockdown policy. But that's not why we have mobile telephones. We have them for us, not for the state. And if the state wishes to use them in this way, it has to be extraordinarily careful. It has to find the right type of emergency to tell people about. And what does fall into that category? I don't think the weather does. That there are already weather forecasts, and we have them on this programme every day, but there are newspaper reports and so on. What type of emergency would it be? With COVID, for example, it took days, if not weeks, to build up before people realised there was an emergency people needed to be warned about. So it's hard to see what the right case for this will be. It's the government doing it because it can, and interfering in our lives because it can. But I take the opposite view. I don't want the government to interfere in my life unless it has to. And that should be a guiding principle for the state's interrelationship with the individual. So my advice to you, if you want to know the news, watch GB News. If you want to be lectured and shouted at by the government, allow them to. But as I say, I've switched mine off. But I want to know what you think. Get in touch with me, please. As always, email me at mailmog@gbnews. But I'm very pleased to be joined by a distinguished former minister, Norman Baker, who was at the Home Office under the coalition government. Norman, you've never been an advocate of the big state.
No.
Have you got this switched on your telephone? Do you think it's proportionate?
I don't know if I've got it switched on, to be honest with you. I mean, there are practical points and there are philosophical points. Let's be generous to the government. It can be the case, for example, if a flood suddenly occurs, water rises very quickly, it can be important to warn people. That's the generous interpretation of what's happening here. But we also know from Hawaii that people were warned of a ballistic missile attack from this system, quite wrongly, and caused a great deal of alarm and despondency at that point. We also know, and I know from my time at the Home Office, that some women who are subject to abuse at home from their partners will keep a mobile phone secret as a kind of lifeline in those circumstances if they have to make a phone call. The last thing they want is this phone ringing on Sunday to go off. But on the philosophical point, Jacob, that you refer to, you know, I'm a Liberal, and one of the things that runs through Liberals for centuries, from John Stuart Mill onwards, is considering the balance between the state and the individual. And I've always taken the view that the state should not have too much power, because if you give a person or a party or a government or an organisation too much power, then at some point they will abuse that power against the individual. So I'm very wary of anything which encourages the state to take more responsibility for us as individuals. And you talk about trivialisation. You know, I was on a bus today coming here, and there was an announcement over the bus telling mothers not to leave their buggy unattended. I mean, do mothers need to be told that by TfL? Do we need to be told on trains, on stations, to hold the handrail and face the direction of travel? That's what you hear at London Bridge. So I just think that we are being patronised and treated as children quite often. We mustn't have that ingrained in our society.
And once the government has this access, it inevitably uses it. So we will be told that this will only be used at the highest state of emergency, that when the Thames is literally about to come over, the barriers failed and we're all about to be washed away. But then, after a year or two, it'll be used because the government feels it's time to give us a message. There may be a bit of snow coming, there may be half an inch of snow and the roads will be difficult. Because that is the nature of government and announcements, isn't it?
It is, and you'll have pressure from members of Parliament saying, why didn't you tell people this was happening? And the government will then have to respond to that by making announcements in the future of that nature as you describe. It's a slippery slope, to be honest with you. I'm not particularly happy with it.
And what else can they do? Once they can make it sound, how long is it before people decide to give you actual messages? So instead of it just being a noise, it is a voice coming out to tell you that this is what is about to happen. And it becomes very intrusive.
It does become intrusive, and I find personally announcements on trains and buses intrusive and quite unnecessary. But you know, you come back to what mobile phone does, and you said in your introduction that mobile phones are there for our benefit as consumers. But the fact is, and I know this from my home office days, every single mobile phone is a personal tracker. It tells people in authority, if they want to abuse that power now, where you are, who you've called, how long the call was, and of course the protections in law against inappropriate state behaviour are really quite limited. And in my time in government, we fought quite hard to make sure that if the government's going to give itself more powers, you need to introduce safeguards in parallel, and that wasn't always done. So, you know, when I was in the Home Office, again, we ended up with, at meetings, when you went to secure meetings, your phone was placed in a lead box, literally, outside the room, because the ability to monitor that phone is enormous.
So the message is people should be quite careful about their mobile telephones, because actually I had the same experience as you as a minister. In really secret meetings, your telephone is taken off you and hidden away, because not only our government but foreign governments can use it.
Particularly the Chinese, actually.
Who have, and then they have access to secret information. But it's the routine tracking, which was of course used during COVID. Admittedly, it was bulk data rather than trying to track individuals, but they could tell exactly how people were moving about the country. Do you think that on balance was a reasonable way of dealing with a crisis, or was too much information being culled by the government that it didn't need?
I expect too much was being culled, to use your phrase. But, you know, go back to my philosophical point, my John Stuart Mill point. The individual was able to balance themselves, if you like, against the power of the state for quite a long time. They could always escape, they could go somewhere, they could be not found. Now they can be tracked everywhere by phones, by CCTV. We've got more CCTV in this country than almost anywhere else in the world. It is almost impossible to escape the state if the state wishes to pursue you. Now, our governments, I'm not saying they're perfect, they're not, but they've been relatively benign over the years in terms of what they could do compared to, say, the Chinese government. But suppose our government is not benign in the future. The power they have at their fingertips will be enormous to control the population.
But one of the most interesting things, to my mind, is that Parliament used to be the great protector of liberties. If you look at the late 19th century, even into the early 20th century, your party was always defending liberty and was very reluctant to allow the state any encroachment on the individual. That's just not true anymore. Mostly Parliament, which people can see behind me, is saying, why haven't you done this? Why don't we take more control? What has changed that, and how do we pull it back?
Well, I don't know how we pull it back, and I don't know quite why it's happened in that particular way. It is extraordinary, and someone ought to write a thesis on why that has been the case. But you're right, that the voices champion liberty and freedom in a real sense, I think, are diminished, sometimes absent. And I think it may come down to the quality of MPs, speaking as a former MP myself. But you know, we have too many apparatchiks in Parliament these days who've come straight out of university, gone into central office somewhere for one of the parties, and then straight to Parliament without ever having a proper job. And I think that's part of the problem. We need people in Parliament who are actually prepared to be independent, to stand up for what they believe in, and have been around the block a couple of times.
Well, I think classical liberalism is a very attractive political creed. Norman, thank you so much for coming in. We did ask the government to put a statement forward, or even a spokesman to tell us what they thought about this, but they decided not to. They just want to shout at you on St George's Day. Don't forget to let me know what you think. mailmog@gbnews.uk. Coming up, our beloved upper chamber, the House of Lords, has been caught in controversy. Find out after the break. And don't forget to stick around with a debate with one of the animal rights activists who disrupted the Grand National. We'll be hearing it straight from the horse's mouth. Even worse jokes to come.
It's all about family, being in people's living rooms, all the interaction and getting to know who our viewers and listeners are.
When I was young, my dad used to say, "Nana, stop arguing." I wanted an outlet that would enable me to give my opinion.
People are going through a really hard time right now, and I know that you don't feel like you're being listened to by the establishment. I came to GB News because it's the People's Channel, and I want the audience to have their say on the events of the day.
We're dynamic. We do something different.
Democracy shows that the wisdom of the nation is in its people.
I get to travel to find out what the story is from a personal perspective.
The British people aren't fools. We know when we're not being told the full story.
We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this.
It's the best country in the world.
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent your views.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Hello, I'm Michelle Dewberry, and you can join me every weekday 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr.
You're an inspiration to us all.
Clip that bit up.
Well, you are.
That's my ringtone. My political ambitions are, those days are gone, I can tell you.
She's only teasing. Go on.
He's probably going to want to lay down now. I'll give him 2 minutes to have one. Let's respectfully disagree. That's what we like on Jubes and Kerr. Come and join us. GB News, the People's Channel.
Michelle Dewberry, weekday evenings at 6 o'clock.
Start the day with GB News.
We catch up on all the big stories you didn't hear the night before.
And take a look at what the world's talking about this morning. That's right, Monday to Thursdays from 6 o'clock. It's Breakfast with Eamon and Isabel.
Straight after breakfast, join us, Bev Turner and Andrew Pearce. We're going to take you through till noon.
We'll be tackling the big topics of the day, including the things that the other channels just won't talk about. If it's happening here. Wake up to mornings on GB News, the People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
I'm Simon Evans. Join me on GB News for Headliners at 11 p.m.
What's the scoop?
I'll be joined by 2 of the country's top comedians.
That's right.
As we take a look at tomorrow's newspapers tonight.
We're going to get into trouble.
If it's a big story, we'll be covering it.
Spill some tea on him.
There we go.
But we'll also have some fun.
I wouldn't stick up a bank.
My father didn't love me.
So anyway,
Headliners every night from 11 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
We've got a brand new lineup every Saturday night on GB News.
From 6 p.m, I'll give you my unique take on the world today.
Then at 7, it's me, Calvin Robinson, with my Common Sense Crusade.
New to GB News is the Saturday 5.
5 times the opinion. Join us every Saturday from 8 p.m. as we debate the week's stories.
With us 4, plus a special guest.
And at 9, of course, it's Mark Dolan Tonight. Brand new Saturday nights on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back. I'm still Jacob Rees-Mogg, and this is State of the Nation. You've been getting in touch with your thoughts. Tim says, millions of motorists, coaches, trucks, etc. will be travelling on our motorways and roads on Sunday. How many accidents do you think this madness will cause? Pete says, Am I wrong to read into the fact that HM Government and Oliver Dowden have chosen to disturb our St George's Day with this blasted siren? Why this day and not another? John says, Jacob, surely the phone emergency warning is solely for an imminent nuclear attack. I wish that were true. It's not. Was I against the 4-minute warning? No. But this isn't what this is about. Chelsea, what a lovely message you've sent. First of all, you've switched off your alert 2 and for your Nana, and it's not for severe floods and weather, and you've asked me to say hello to your Nana Mary. So, hello, Chelsea's Nana Mary. It may not surprise you to know Mary is my favourite girl's name. That's why my daughter is called Mary. Moving on. A severe, though not unfriendly, critic of our institutions said that the cure for admiring the House of Lords was to go and look at it. Badgett. That was indeed Walter Badgett who said that, though he didn't name the critic who he was quoting. It's not, he's quoting somebody else. And it's a very important point, because the House of Lords is, in theory, a marvellous body made up of all these wonderful panjandrums who are enormously distinguished and learned and so on and so forth. But in fact, when you go and look at it, they're not. They're politicians who you remember that they used to be somebody once, and you're not entirely sure whether they still are or they are somebody else. It's not this great bastion of wisdom. And what has recently emerged is that since the 2016 referendum, the government has lost more than half of all votes in the House of Lords, a milestone previously achieved just once this century in the session from 2019 to 21, the session that executed Brexit, when more than 2/3 of all votes were defeated by the Lords. Now, this is really important because the Lords hate Brexit. It is full of Remainers, many of them lefties, and this has meant that the democratic will, as exercised in the referendum and by a general election in 2019, is being thwarted by peers stuck in the 1970s who were avid pro-Europeans. Now, I've long thought the Tories should simply appoint more peers to get its business through, so we have a fair representation of Brexit peers. Actually, I think Nigel Farage, my co-presenter, would make an excellent peer of the realm. But enough of what I think. Vox Populi Vox Dei. We asked the people what they thought of the House of Lords, and the people have spoken.
The highest court in the country. I'm very happy with it the way it is.
Happy. They verify laws, I think. I don't know why you need a especially one which isn't elected, a second chamber which isn't elected. If it was elected, it would be more democratic, but it seems an anachronism.
Probably for people to know about what it does.
They're doing well for themselves, but not for the public. We don't need the House of Lords, do we, really? You're paying these guys a salary for what? To turn up, and that's it. You know, this country's gone to pot.
There's a bit of a mixed bag today, and also, just to correct the record, it's no longer the highest court in the land. That role was ridiculously taken away by a terrible constitutional reform, but that's perhaps a discussion for another day. Because with me is my meretricious panel, the fiery Toby Young of the Free Speech Union and the popular socialist Stephen Pound. Come on, Stephen, old socialist. Do you love the House of Lords? Do you want to keep it?
I don't. I think you make a very valid criticism. Though when you say it's full of Remainers, it's full of remainders in many cases. These are people who simply were somebody something. Look, I think we start from two basic premises. Firstly, the idea of a revising second chamber is a good one. Most places in the world have and having people like Aradazi and some of the people you have in the House, Admiral West, Roberth, and people like that. But then, is the present House of Lords the best we can do? Why the only legislature outside the Majlis in Iran, where religious leaders can sit in the House of Lords as of right? The idea is you have theologians, the bishops of the Church of England can automatically come in there. Look, it's far too big. It's far too full of cronies. The present process for actually filtering nominees to the House of Lords, I was actually asked, by my party leader to go there. And I said, no, I'm not dead yet. Please, give me a chance.
Not dead, but in the Elysian fields, to quote Israeli. Toby, would you like to be in the House of Lords?
Well, if duty calls, Jacob, I wouldn't decline.
That's a yes.
But I remember when I was doing politics A-level and the question came up, why hasn't the House of Lords been reformed? And I was able to ask my father, who was made a life peer by Jim Callaghan, and he said it's never going to be reformed by the House of Commons, because if they reformed it and made it more democratic, they'd have to grant it more power. Its undemocratic nature is an excuse for not giving it much power. But interestingly, in the past few years, particularly since the Brexit vote, it has acquired more power. Its power to obstruct legislation has come to the fore in the last 6 or 7 years.
And that's really important, isn't it? Because a revising chamber that goes through statutory instruments and says technically these aren't correct, or asks the government to think again on a badly drafted piece of law, or one that gives ministers excessive powers, that's a completely proper role. But in recent years, particularly post-Brexit, the House of Lords has challenged again and again on policy.
Look, you and I have
sat
sat on committees in the House of Commons. We've sat on endless committees, and in Finance Bill Committee. You know, we should actually be doing this in the House of Commons. Now, the first time that actually major reform came up, it was actually defeated by a strange combination of Michael Foot and Enoch Powell. And one of the things that they objected to, to have a directly elected House of Lords, was the fact that it would then be in competition with the House of Commons. So I think slim it down, stop putting in cronies. I mean, we've now got a sort of Maundy Gregory situation where people can buy seats in the House of Lords.
But it's always been cronies. It's been cronies since its first creation.
Well, since Charles II, certainly.
Well, but even earlier, kings always put their mates into the House of Lords because they wanted, as soon as it was a legislature, to have control of it. That was important to them.
But that's the case against, isn't it?
One of the reasons I think the House of Lords has suddenly acquired more power than it's had before is because of the very rapid turnover in Prime Ministers. When a new Prime Minister comes into Downing Street, they have their own agenda, they want to put their stamp on Parliament, and so we have the illegal migration bill, for instance, which Rishi wants to get through before the election.
I think it's the removal of the hereditaries, because the hereditaries knew they were there on sufferance and therefore didn't push the boundaries. And it's important to remember that 2015 is the first time since at least 1832 when the Conservatives in government have not had a majority in the House of Lords. During the coalition, there was an effective majority with the Lib Dems. The coalition had a majority. Before that, from the removal of the hereditaries, obviously it wasn't a Conservative government. And therefore, you've got a non-Conservative majority able to challenge a Conservative government and feeling it's entitled to, because the hereditaries, by and large, have gone, the bit that made it least valid.
But they do have a majority in members. I mean, they're still the biggest single party. Look,
but not a majority.
No, not an overall majority. No, you have marvellous people like Lord Hilton, and you have marvellous independents.
Well, his wife is my godmother, so I'm a particular admirer.
I have no idea.
I'm a particular admirer.
I wasn't creeping, honestly.
He is the most wonderful man, exactly what a hereditary peer ought to be.
Let me just take you back to Dublin in 1923. You got the Irish Free State becomes the Irish Republic, and they decide, what are we going to do for a government? You know, for an Oireachtas, a Dáil and a Sean. Should we have a single party? And they decided to have a bicameral legislation with the lower house, the Dáil, and the upper house, the Sean. But they decided that the second house would be purely on occupations. So there'd be somebody to represent the farmers, somebody to represent the W.B. Yeats, and of course, unfortunately, within 2 years, you then had Fianna Fáil farmers and Fine Gael tax collectors. So I don't think anyone's come up with a decent solution yet, but we could get there. But the question is, Jacob, how do we say to the president, what's it, 700 odd people in the House of Lords, we're going to slim you down so that you must never, ever exceed the numbers in the House of Commons?
We've got to move on, but I'll tell you my retirement scheme is offer them each a step up in the peerage. So if you're a life baron, offer them a viscountcy, hereditary, and they'd all retire like a shot, even the socialists, particularly the socialists. Anyway, thank you to my panel. They'll be sticking around, so you won't want to go anywhere. But coming up, we'll be touching on how we can improve what the late Nigel Lawson called England's national religion, the NHS. Is privatisation the way forward? The mere suggestion seems to upset all the right people. And find out later, what do you call a horse in disguise?
I joined GB News because I was sick and tired of not hearing my views being represented, not just mine, but so many people that I knew and spoke to.
I just couldn't get my voice out there. I couldn't say anything, I couldn't do anything. Whatever the narrative was, I kind of had to follow it.
GB News is there to provide a voice for those who have been ignored by the establishment media. We think different things, we've got a different style.
GB News is here to be optimistic and positive about the future.
It's real kind of dynamic and flowing, with the audience very much at the heart of it. like a big family.
Here at GB News, we talk about the things that matter to you.
Hearing the voices from right across our towns and cities, especially our towns.
All sides of the argument represented with a heavy dose of opinion.
We're on a mission here to make a difference.
And the GB News family really is here for you, and whatever time of day you can watch or listen.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Westminster is going around in ever-decreasing circles, followed by the media. Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it? Join me at 7 p.m, Mondays to Thursdays on Farage, here on GB News. We will have open, rational debate. We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this. Join us here on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain is watching.
You've probably seen politicians interviewed 1,000 times, but we do it differently. We find out who they really are, we don't shout, we chat, and hopefully we bring a bit of light, not just heat. Did you know Kate Moss?
Apparently.
Do you have a pair of jeans or a pair of jeans?
No, of course I don't. What would I do with them?
My friends are like, oh my God, what's she doing now?
Join me every Sunday at 6 for Gloria Meets, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Jacob Rees-Mogg, the Member of Parliament for North East Somerset and a former government minister. For years, I've walked the corridors of power in both Westminster and the City of London. We need to have the arguments, the discussions on how we make it better.
Crop failures, famine, war, suffering on a scale completely unimaginable.
We are putting the cart before the horse. As Charles I said at the scaffold, he was the true defender of liberty.
Yeah, I've completely derailed the conversation.
Join me Monday to Thursday at 8 p.m. on GB News, Britain's news channel.
I'm Mark White. As GB News Home and Security Editor, I cover those key issues that are so important to you. Our authorities, our communities doing all they can to combat violent crime. With the public services under unbearable strain, why are we still failing to control our borders? Defence, the first priority of any government, has been continually hollowed out. Can we trust our politicians to protect the armed forces? Join me, Mark White, on GB News.
Welcome back. I remain Jacob Rees-Mogg, and this is State of the Nation. You've been getting in touch with your inspired thoughts. Alan says, each new administration should select 400 to 500 lords to do the necessary work. The rest should go on gardening leave with no recourse to public funds. David says, Jacob, the House of Lords is totally undemocratic. In this country, we're living a pseudo-democracy, giving jobs for friends. It must be reformed. John, the Lords would be OK, Jacob, if it wasn't full of the loony left, Liberals and bishops. I actually quite like having bishops in the House of Lords. We should have abbots as well. Stephen says it's just full of Tony Blair's mates, and I think that's the point at which we will go on to discuss the ceaseless sobbing from the unions, which reached a new peak today, as Unison, British largest trade union, claimed that £1 million a week is being spent on private ambulances. But I'm afraid there's nothing new to this. Use of the private sector to support the struggling NHS is routine. And while the merest mention of the word privatisation has become heresy against what the late Nigel Lawson called England's national religion, we haven't yet got the law de heretico combrendo, but we're not far off it. The private sector is efficient, and using it will take us closer to the superior Australian or possibly even the Japanese system, in which healthcare is paid for by the state but can be provided by private companies. Joining me now to discuss this is the GP and producer of the great NHS heist, Dr. Bob Gill. Dr. Gill, thank you so much for joining me. Isn't it sensible to use private resources to help out the NHS as long as the free at the point of use principle remains?
No, the private sector is interested in generating profit. They do this in healthcare by avoiding sick and expensive people. When they have been used in the NHS, they often cherry pick. That means they take the simplest cases, the most profitable cases. When clinical services started being outsourced in the early 2000s under Tony Blair, they were being paid more per operation than the NHS was. So they cherry pick, they cream off the easiest, most profitable work. And as we see in America, the most privatized system in developed countries, they have to have the state to step in a dysfunctional system by providing Medicare for children and the poor, and Medicaid for the elderly. In fact, that's the other way around. So private medicine doesn't work. Healthcare is a natural monopoly. Kenneth Arrow back in the 60s won a Nobel Prize in economics for working this out, because we have a problem in the market. Market drives profit, and profit is not to be found with the very sickest of patients.
But profit drives efficiency, and the NHS is not efficient. That's quite clear. And we have long waiting lists, and the private sector can reduce some of those waiting lists. And yes, it can make a profit, but that actually means it is competitive and wants to see more patients. Whereas actually in the NHS, you get the same amount of money even if you don't have the flow through of patients.
Okay, so let's look at two examples of the private sector helping us out in the NHS. First of all, private finance initiative. This is a financial scandal of private finance.
The private finance initiative was a ridiculous scheme of Gordon Brown's, primarily, to get off-balance sheet financing. That was a fiddle. Let's stick to the provision of healthcare rather than of the PFIs, because they were a government swindle.
The private sector.
But let's talk about hip operations, where you can get more done faster on the private sector.
There is no country in the world that delivers universal comprehensive care in a private system. In a private system, you need a parallel bureaucracy. We had an amazingly efficient system. We collected money through general taxation, but in order to get all these contracts with the private sector, you need a market, you need a bureaucracy. In 2006, the Bloor report from York University estimated that the increase in cost due to marketisation sucking out 10% of the NHS budget. PFI, we borrowed 11 billion. We've
got a waiting list of 7 million people.
It does not sound like efficiency. This is a totally bogus argument.
Nobody believes the NHS is the best in the world anymore. There's a waiting list of 7 million that private hospitals can provide a service, they can provide it in a cost-effective manner, and they can ensure people get treated. Surely this is a good thing.
It's not a good thing, because we've had 10 years of austerity on the NHS. We've had a stagnation in funding.
We haven't. We're spending records amount on the NHS.
If you let me finish my point, the funding of the NHS historically has been 4%. We've had a decade of defunding at 1%. The government have created a problem for which it has a predetermined solution. And in July
as a percentage of GDP, we're spending as much as our nearest neighbours. And it's gone up and up. I've got to move to my panel, so I'm sorry to cut you off, but thank you so much for joining me. We disagree fundamentally, but a lot of bad figures are bandied about on the NHS. We hear that it's been underfunded. It's massively funded. The increases over COVID are tens of billions of pounds, and waiting lists are at record level. Stephen, you told me earlier you were born on the same day as the NHS.
Yeah, I mean, I'd say first of all, I'm grateful to Dr. Gill for the work he does, but I think sadly, he's falling into the mistake that Wes Streeting quite rightly identified as we treat the NHS as a shrine, not a service. Now look, the NHS and I were both born in July 1948, and within 3 years we had a thing called the Gillibo Report, which said that it was financially unsustainable. The NHS on the old Beveridge model only worked if men left school at 15, worked till they were 65 and died when they were 75, and women didn't work. They stayed at home and looked after the elderly and infirm. So the private sector was massively involved. GPs do not work for the NHS. There was no ophthalmology, there's no dentistry. The ambulance services, all of those were outside the NHS. And I think when we look at Germany, we look at Spain, we look at France, there are better systems of doing it. I think the fact that we throw up this sort of straw man of America, and because America is chaotic and appalling, doesn't necessarily mean that an element of private practice within the NHS is a bad thing. I honestly don't think that the present NHS is sustainable, quite simply because demand is elastic and supply is inelastic.
Well, I think Wes Streeting's been really important because he has opened up the debate in a way that a Conservative politician couldn't do. Toby?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Wes Streeting, I agree with Stephen Pound. It's a false dichotomy to think it's either America or our model. There are much more attractive models, mixed economies between state-funded medical service provided out of general taxation and some kind of social insurance, like they have in Germany, like they have in France, and that tends to be a much more efficient system that delivers better outcomes. The idea of a health service which is free at the point of delivery is attractive, but it's not being delivered. That's why a report today revealed that 1 in 8 people are going to private GPs because they can't get appointments with their GPs. It is the national religion, or it was when Nigel Lawson identified it as such, but so is Christianity 50 years ago. Look at the state of Christianity today. We can easily become a nation of apostates when it comes to the NHS.
I mean, it seems even more of a national religion now, except that we discovered in today's paper that 35% of people are using private medicine, and therefore the stigma may be going. I mean, I'm very happy to say that I use private medicine. I have a private GP who I would go to in London, and I think that reduces the burden on the NHS. I actually think it is a good thing for people who can to use private medicine.
Isn't the reality that we have a notional health service, not a national health service? We have everybody believes that there is this marvellous health service which provides basically open heart surgery in a cottage hospital environment. Everybody wants to have that thing. The reality is it simply doesn't work like that anymore. And I think what we have to do is we have to accept that there are problems with bureaucracy within the present NHS, and anyone who thinks the private sector is purely the answer to that, there simply aren't. There's huge amount of bureaucracy in the competing health trusts at the present time. We could still have a much bigger involvement of the private sector and still have it free at the point of use.
One way, I think, to encourage more people to use private GPs, which would mean more people being able to access ordinary GPs, is if private GPs could refer you as patients to the NHS if you needed an operation. At the moment, they can't. There is this bureaucratic hurdle, which makes it very unattractive. You think, well, I could pay, I could afford to pay for a private GP appointment, but if it's anything serious, I then have to go back and get an appointment with my ordinary GP. If they stop that, many more people, I think, would be prepared to pay for private GPs. It would free up the time of ordinary GPs, and it would make things a lot easier.
I think you're right, but don't forget, when Beveridge actually did his first blueprint for the NHS, he thought it would wither away in 10 or 15 years because health prevention, because if you remember, the Beveridge report wasn't just about health, it was about idleness and sloth and all.
Yes.
And he felt that the nation would be so much more healthy. The trouble is, our NHS deals with people once they are ill. What it doesn't do is work in preventative medicine, and that's where we should be concentrating much, much more. It's cost-effective and it's better for the health of the nation.
Toby, then we get into the issues of the nanny state, and you and I get very critical of governments when they start telling people how to lead their lives.
I'd love to have a nanny.
Yeah, I mean, preventative, it's not as if people have been neglecting preventative medicine. You know, we had, PHE, focusing on trying to stop people smoking, reduce people drinking, now been scrapped because it wasn't fit for purpose, been replaced by UK HSE. It doesn't seem to be doing a much better job. Well, no, it hasn't really worked. People don't want to be told what they can and can't eat, whether they should smoke, how much they should drink, by the nanny state. It doesn't seem to be doing much to prevent people getting ill.
No, 1952, the Times had a headline about the Chadwick report, which was about the conditions of the labouring, but it said, "We will not be bullied into health." And I think that there's still that attitude of some people. I don't know why people object to the nanny state. You know, I love the idea of Mary Poppins with a starched apron, cuddling you to her chest and, you know, giving you some warm milk last thing at night. Bring it on.
Just a spoonful of sugar. Just a spoonful of sugar helps the medicine go down in the most delightful way.
Yeah.
Thank you to my brilliant panellists. Up next, find out which has more legs, a horse or no horse.
Monday to Thursday nights on GB News. At 6, it's Dubes & Co. 7 o'clock, Farage. At 8, join Jacob Rees-Mogg. And at 9, Dan Wootton Tonight, followed by headliners on TV, radio and online. This is GB News.
First and foremost, I am a GB News fan, and I was before I was working here. Just love the fact that we're asking the questions that a lot of establishment media won't ask.
With a bit of a twist, we not only want to inform you, but we want to keep you entertained.
It's worth the drive because you get in and the team's all ready and waiting, they're itching to go, and it's a proper little family.
GB News is the people's channel.
It's the audience that makes the programme sing.
We're giving our viewers and our listeners a voice. I see the thousands of your letters, tweets, emails, you name it, coming in.
Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it?
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent you.
It's time for something different. It's time for GB News. I'm very patriotic. I believe in Britain. Our best days lie ahead.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Join us here on GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Join me, Patrick Christie's, Monday to Friday, 3 till 6. We tackle the day's news agenda like you've never seen before. It's high tempo, high octane, the most controversial topics, and the best guests. You will not be able to take your eyes and ears off it. I'm not afraid to ask the questions that you really want answered. 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
GB News has its own late-night paper preview show, Headliners, where comedians take you through the next day's top news stories. You don't have to bother reading the newspaper, we've got it covered for you. Headliners, every night at 11 p.m, and repeated every morning at 5 a.m. We won't send you to sleep like some of the other paper review shows out there. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Camilla Tominey, on Sunday mornings from 9:30, taking the politicians to task and breaking out of SW1 to see how their decisions are affecting you across the UK. Bursting the Westminster bubble every Sunday morning, only on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain's watching.
Hello, I'm Calvin Robinson. Do not miss my Common Sense Crusade Saturdays at 7 p.m. Join me for some in-depth discussions on faith. Is that not the start of the slippery slope? It's very much so. And the big moral questions of the day. I'm baffled.
You've got some nerve.
Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my 2 comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back. I'm Jacob Rees-Mogg, and this is still State of the Nation. You've been getting in touch with your thoughts. So Trevor says, Dear Jacob, you eat foie gras, which I do, so don't care about animal suffering and are the wrong person to debate what happened at the Grand National. I don't agree. If you eat meat, what type of meat you eat is surely a pedantic point, is merely a distraction. Either you think eating meat is all right and husbanding animals for food is fine, or you don't. Andrew says, your argument for privatisation being a cure-all for the NHS is not really held true by what happened to the nation's railways or waterways or energy. P.S. The private health companies do not want competition, ultimately. They want absolute control of the market. Competition is always essential, and the problem with the railways is they never privatised the track with the trains, and therefore they've had a ridiculous system that has never known which way it's going, really. Dangerous with trains. Susan, you are kind. Jacob, glad to see you no longer need the plaster on your thumb. Love the programme and GB News. Of all things, I managed to cut my finger opening a packet of Bath Oliver biscuits, which was pretty hopeless. And Colin says the NHS was originally intended for UK people, not the world. That sounds like a further discussion that we could have someday. Anyway, I hope you will have forgiven some of the cheesy jokes, but I thought I'd better give you the answers. What do you call a horse in disguise? Mask a pony. And which has more legs, a horse or no horse? No horse, obviously. No horse has 5 legs. Think about it. No horse has 5 legs. Now, enough joking around. I need to get off my high horse and get down to business. Throughout the past couple of weeks, animal rights activists have been disrupting one of the great British institutions of horse racing. The spell of protest reached its peak over the weekend at the Grand National, when protesters attempted to gain entry to the track. Over 100 have been arrested. But perhaps most interestingly and worryingly, after 3 horses died at the event, one of the trainers who spoke to GB News an hour ago on Nigel's show claimed the protesters indirectly caused his horse's death. I'm joined now by Animal Rising spokesman Ben Newman. Ben.
Evening.
Thank you for coming in. I don't know if you heard the trainer of Hill 16.
Yeah.
But he says that the disruption caused, the tension that caused with a highly strung animal, was one of the reasons Hill 16 died. Yeah. Now, you're a protester, you are protesting in favour of animal rights. That must be the last thing you want to happen.
Yes, I've been hearing this all day. I was actually on the BBC with him earlier this morning, and it's just ridiculous. So I was on a Talk TV a week ago with the great Julia Hartley-Brewer, and said the reason we're just going to disrupt the Grand National is because I watched a video from 2019 and over the first jump a horse falls over and breaks their neck. And then when I watched the video most recently, I actually thought it was a video from the same year. It was a completely predictable outcome, and there's nothing
But this horse has got around the course safely many times before, and you could see from the preparation beforehand that the animals were getting very stressed by the delay in starting, and that was the wrong way for them to be starting the race.
I mean, I'm sure Sandy's a nice guy, but there's clearly a vested
He'd know his
interest
animals, wouldn't he? Because he trains them.
Yeah.
You know, he would know his horses, and trainers have a very close relationship with their horses.
Yeah, so if the horses really were clearly that stressed, they could have decided not to run the race. We were trying to stop the race. We didn't want it to run. But of course they wouldn't stop running the race because there's hundreds of millions bet on it, and all the breeders also want to make money from the horses winning. So the only reason the horses are running that race is to make money.
Well, and it's a legal activity that people are allowed to do this. If you want to stop horse racing, why don't you stand for Parliament on that platform?
Well, maybe I will one day, but that's a long way away. But I don't think I've ever seen an action of this type that caused disruption on this scale to receive so much public support. If you've been listening to any of the radio call-ins or even the comments, the trolls have gone running. There's huge public support for this. So
if there's support for it, I'll go back to my question, why don't you stand for Parliament? Because if there's that much support for it, you would win elections.
Yeah, well, protest is... so this is about democracy, and protest is a fundamental part of democracy. It always has been and it always will be. So there's nothing unusual about people...
Oh, but there's protest and protest, isn't there? Yeah. And I think we can, maybe good time to look at the events from the Crucible this evening, because there's been a protest there. And do you think that is a legitimate form of protest too, to the extent you've heard about it? We're going to see the clip now.
Well, I don't quite know what that was for. Terrible scene.
And do you think that's democratic protest or that's hooliganism?
Well, they're trying to raise the alarm on the climate crisis, and they didn't hurt anyone. But is that effective? That's the question. Is that effective? And maybe it is, maybe it isn't. But that's not really what we didn't organise it.
But
so.
you were trying to do the same thing, effectively. You were trying to disrupt and stop a race that gives people a lot of pleasure, that's a legal activity. You could have marched in Parliament Square. That's a legitimate form of protest, rather than this violent, aggressive protest that disrupts legal events. That's where I think there's a dividing line.
Well, it wasn't violent or aggressive. So people just walked onto the racecourse. Everyone was wearing pink T-shirts, and it was completely... There were 100... And also there's a certain democratic element to it. It was 118 people got arrested, and that's not... And you can say that's a small number, but it's not 118 people signing a petition. People really do care about this, and that's been reflected by the amount of support.
But is that why you have to go for direct action? Because actually 118 marching down Whitehall, you wouldn't even notice, would you? They'd all be on the pavement.
Yeah, of course. You'd of course, just walking down the street doing nothing. So you have to cause a fuss, and that's how...
But do you, or is this symbolic of the fact you've got very small numbers, and therefore to get attention, you have to take extreme measures?
We haven't got very small numbers, so...
Then why didn't you have a proper march down Whitehall to show your big numbers?
I mean, if you've organised a protest, even if you've got 10,000 people marching down Whitehall, you wouldn't get pressed for it.
So you've got small numbers. That's the thing. On the Iraq War, they had 2 million people marching down Whitehall.
Well, the Iraq War
on
went
the Countryside
ahead,
Alliance, in favour of countryside pursuits, they had over 1 million people marching down Whitehall. That's why I'm saying to you, it's small numbers.
I never heard of that either.
So you have to be disruptive, you have to do things that are illegal, because you don't actually have democratic support.
I think it's quite hard to get... people willing... Everyone there got arrested and may face legal consequences. So that's I guess you could say, the tip of the iceberg, but there is a huge amount of support. Honestly, LBC, it was the jockey... The only people coming out to defend it are the Horse Jockey Association, breeders, and racehorse trainers, and your good self.
You keep on saying there's huge amount of support. You've got 118 people. You don't stand for Parliament. You don't try and win elections. You don't try and organise proper marches. Because actually you haven't got huge support. You've got a few people on social media. That's not huge support.
Well, we're going to see, actually, because there's the YouGov poll. They've said today they're going to test. It's going to be about the Grand National. So So we can debate we can go around in circles, but yeah, we'll see on that how much support there is.
I'd reiterate my challenge that you should stand for Parliament, because if you really believe that there is popular support for this, you may need to persuade a political party to take up this cause, or set up your own party. But it's the same challenge to the Just Stop Oil people. If you really believe you've got this support, why on earth aren't you standing for Parliament?
Yeah.
I would hope to give you the last word. I've talked too much, because apparently I've got to go over to the next programme. Because that's all from me, but up next is the revered Dan Wootton. Mr Wootton, what have you got in store this evening?
Parliament, exactly. What the heck are you doing? I completely agree with you, Jacob. Look, we've got lots on the way. I'm furious, though, about The Guardian. I don't know if you see this. The Guardian conspiring with Conservative Party wits to describe Suella Braverman as a racist bigot. Well, tonight, Jacob, I'm making it clear that the only racist bigots are those at The Guardian on the left who think that the Home Secretary has to think a certain way because of the colour of her skin.
Well, I would recommend people to read the Somerset Guardian rather than the Manchester Guardian, where I have a weekly column which is of interest to all and sundry. But that'll be great stuff, Dan. Thank you so much. Coming up after the weather. I'll be back tomorrow at 8 o'clock. I'm Jacob Rees-Mogg, and this has been State of the Nation.
Evening, I'm Alex Deakin, and this is your latest weather update from the Met Office. Probably a cloudy start for many of us tomorrow morning, but it's expected to turn sunnier. There will be a fairly brisk easterly breeze, making it feel quite chilly on North Sea coasts. High pressure is responsible for that, also bringing many of us dry weather for much of this week. One or two light showers here and there with some thick cloud in places this evening, but they're tending to fade away. I think we'll see the cloud increasing once more across the east, and that will spread west as we go through the night. But still some good breaks in the cloud across parts of West Wales, northwest England. That will allow it to turn a little chilly. A pocket or two of frost isn't out of the question in rural spots. Most towns and cities, though, start Tuesday at 5 or 6. Most of us will start with a lot of cloud, but I think that cloud will tend to melt away over parts of central and eastern England, clearing from western areas too. It may linger on some of the coasts across eastern Scotland into the afternoon, but for many it will turn sunny before the cloud increases again across the southeast during the afternoon. With that easterly breeze feeling quite fresh on those North Sea coasts, but in the sunshine further west quite pleasant. We could get close to 20 Celsius over the Highlands once more. During the evening, the cloud will thicken up a little bit more over England and Wales, with the possibility of a few showers coming into southwest England as we head into Wednesday morning. And they'll still be around perhaps through the day here. Perhaps parts of South Wales may also catch a shower. But for most places, again, it's dry and fine on Wednesday. Often fairly cloudy over the Midlands and southern England, but some good spells of sunshine elsewhere. Still that easterly wind bringing a chill to eastern coasts, but further west, temperatures getting into the mid-teens. But overall, it is turning cooler, and that will continue as we go through this week. High pressure still dominating to the north, but increasingly we'll see weather fronts coming in from the east later this week to bring showers.
It's all about family, being in people's living rooms, all the interaction and getting to know who our viewers and listeners are.
When I was young, my dad used to say, "Nana, stop arguing." I wanted an outlet that would enable me to give my opinion.
People are going through a really hard time right now, and I know that you don't feel like you're being listened to by the establishment.
I came to GB News because it's the People's Channel, and I want the audience to have their say on the events of the day.
We're dynamic. We do something different.
Democracy shows that the wisdom of the nation is in its people.
I get to travel to find out what the story is from a personal perspective.
The British people aren't fools. We know when we're not being told the full story.
We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this.
It's the best country in the world.
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent your views.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching. Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News,
The People's Channel,
Britain's news channel.
Hello, I'm Michelle Dewberry, and you can join me every weekday 6 till 7 on Jubes & Co.
You're an inspiration to us all.
Clip that bit up.
Well, you are.
That's my ringtone. My political ambitions those days are gone, I can tell you. She's only teasing. Go on. He's probably going to want to lay down now. I'll give him 2 minutes to have one. Let's respectfully disagree. That's what we like on Jubes & Co. Come and join us. GB News, the People's Channel.
Michelle Dewberry, weekday evenings at 6 o'clock.
Start the day with GB News.
We catch up on all the big stories you didn't hear the night before.
And take a look at what the world's talking about this morning. That's right, Monday to Thursdays from 6 o'clock. It's Breakfast with Eamon and Isabel.
Straight after breakfast, join us, Bev Turner and Andrew Pearce. We're going to take you through till noon.
We'll be tackling the big topics of the day, including the things that the other channels just won't talk about. If it's happening here. Wake up to mornings on GB News, the People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
I'm Simon Evans. Join me on GB News for Headliners at 11 p.m.
What's the scoop?
I'll be joined by two of the country's top comedians.
That's right.
As we take a look at tomorrow's newspapers tonight.
We're going to get into trouble.
If it's a big story, we'll be covering it.
Spill some tea on him.
There we go.
But we'll also have some fun.
I wouldn't stick up a bank.
My father didn't love me.
So anyway,
Headliners every night from 11 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
We've got a brand new lineup every Saturday night on GB News.
From 6 p.m, I'll give you my unique take on the world today.
Then at 7, it's me, Calvin Robinson, with my Common Sense Crusade.
New to GB News is the Saturday 5.
5 times the opinion. Join us every Saturday from 8 p.m. as we debate the week's stories.
With us 4, plus a